I want to encourage you. I specifically made this politics section kind of brief in the sense that I tried not to include too much content because I want to be able to answer any specific political questions that you guys have, okay? So any particular issues that you are curious about, please write them down in the margins or anything, and we'll have a time at the end where we can ask questions. Sound good? Okay. Ignite 303, politics. Section 1. Why do politics matter? The U.S. is a democratic republic, meaning that each citizen has the right and obligation to help shape our national laws. Put another way, our laws reflect the general morality of the nation. Because the U.S. has a strong Christian heritage, so much so that until 1963, all public schools started the day with prayer. The Bible has traditionally been held in high esteem. But since the 1960s, the national culture has taken a dramatic turn away from Christianity, which is why it is more important than ever that Christians seek to influence the national debate towards righteousness. This is the same mandate that we see given to the biblical prophets who were told to call the nation to righteousness. Today, politics is the arena where national morality is debated and ultimately codified into law. Issues such as gay marriage and transgender rights touch on important biblical teachings and have turned many in this generation away from Christianity. As Christians, a weak understanding of political issues leaves us vulnerable to attacks against our faith and biblical authority while silencing us in our mission to disciple the nation in the ways of God. Okay? Politics matter. We have to be able to engage in the national political debate. I think one thing that we can do as Christians is be like, oh, I don't care all about politics. I'm just all about the kingdom. Why do I think that people think like that? Because I used to think like that, okay? When I was in college, I remember I had a friend who was very into politics, and I remember I didn't understand him at all. I was like, what is the big deal, dude? I'm just about the kingdom. Why do you care so much about politics, right? It's just the kingdom, right? I didn't understand until later, and you guys heard some of my testimony with the Seven Mountains, understanding that the kingdom is bigger than the church. Right? What in actuality, I was thinking church, not, why do you care about politics? What about the church, right? But the reality is the kingdom is bigger than just the church, and the kingdom includes politics. Politics matter, and what you see is that many times the biblical people, the prophets and Jesus spoke in issues that were heavily politicized. Okay, and so we cannot be afraid to speak into political issues because they really do matter. All right, part 2. But isn't it best to stay out of politics? Absolutely not. Religious truth and politics will always overlap to some degree, and often the most important truths that a nation must hear become politicized. Slavery was abolished in England and eventually in the U.S. because of the brave efforts of Christians who were often criticized as being too political. Jesus spoke into some of the most controversial political issues of his day, which accounts for much of the persecution he endured. The prophets of the Old Testament were similarly criticized for speaking out on political issues, as was John the Baptist. The Apostle Paul was also persecuted and killed for the political aspects of his preaching, namely that Caesar should not be worshipped. Okay? So I really want to help people understand the reason why the biblical figures are persecuted much of the time is because they're speaking into areas that have become politicized. Okay? It's very important that we understand this, right? Because politics has to do with who is the boss. Politics have to do with who is the boss, who has the power. Okay? That's what politics and government is all about. And so when Christians threaten the people who are in power, oftentimes the next thing that comes is persecution. Okay? This is why Christians throughout history have often become persecuted, because they're doing things that threaten the political power of those who are in charge. Does this make sense? Okay, this is very important, and we did a whole Bible study. This was now last year, really looking into some specific biblical cases. I'll just point out one, but really there are a lot of these types of cases. Okay, what you see is that God sends a prophet from Judah. Well, let me back up a little bit. When Jesus talks to the woman at the well. Do you guys remember the story? She says, one day when Messiah comes, he'll show us where we really worship. Because you Jews say that we're supposed to worship on this mountain, but we believe we're supposed to worship on this mountain. And when Messiah comes, he'll show us which mountain to worship on, right? And Jesus says, surely I tell you, one day it won't matter, for the Father seeks worshipers in spirit and truth. But understand, why is she saying that? Why is she saying that? And you have to understand your Old Testament history to understand where she's coming from. Okay, she was a Samaritan, meaning she was part of the from the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, you have to understand this. After the kingdom split between Israel and Judah, there was a big problem because God had commanded the Israelites to only worship in Jerusalem. Okay, but now the kingdom split. Now Jerusalem is part of the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom does not have Jerusalem in it. And yet the people are commanded to worship God only in Jerusalem, to offer their sacrifices there. Well, that creates a huge problem for the northern kings. So what do? They set up alternative sites of worship, okay? Specifically at Bethel, right? They make an alternative site of worship, and what happens? God sends prophets, and many of these prophets are from Judah, okay? And they go into Israel, and they start to rebuke the nation, right, for this apostasy, right, for this disobedience to God's commandment. And they start to warn them of all the judgments that are going to happen because of this sin issue, okay? Understand, that was the biggest political issue in their day, right? The biggest political issue is, do we really have to worship down there? Why can't we worship God over here? Why can't we worship God on the high places, right? Why do we have to worship God in Jerusalem? And do you understand how this biblical command had become so politicized? Because of political realities, right? And so when those prophets are preaching this, I think to a lot of people, they probably saw it as, oh, these are just agents from the southern kingdom of Judah, right? They're doing this for political reasons, right? But that type of issue happens all the time. Jesus was tested on this issue several times. He's actually tested on political issues, right? Should we pay our taxes to Caesar? This was a huge political debate in Jesus' day. Why? Because they were under the control of the Roman government, and there were many Jews who would say we should oppose Rome, we should fight them, we should not give them our taxes. That money should go to God alone and not to the Romans, right? And others were like, no, like we have to pay our taxes to Caesar. And so that's why they're testing Jesus, right? Because no matter how Jesus answers, he's going to make a whole bunch of enemies with the other side. Does that make sense? Right? Even that passage that we're talking about at lunch, the woman who's caught in adultery, right? This is another test for Jesus. What's the test? Well, the law of Moses says that we should stone this woman, right? But the Romans forbid us from stoning anybody, right? They don't allow us to kill people, right? So Jesus, what should we do? What is Jesus thrown to? He's thrown to another political test, right? Will he obey the Torah, obey the commands of God, or will he obey the Roman rulers? Does this make sense? The nature of these tests that Jesus is constantly thrown into, they're almost always politicized, right? And we need to understand that in this, it's the same exact thing today, right? There are these political issues that Christians don't want to touch. And what's the issue? Because it'll offend people. It'll offend people no matter which way you come down on. And that's why many Christians refuse to touch politics or have anything to do with it. I want to say this. I think that is an abrogation of our responsibility. I'm not saying that we should have opinions on every single political issue. Obviously, some political issues are more important than others, okay? But I would absolutely say that we should not fail to be involved in politics in something where the Bible is clear. If the Bible's clear on something, we should be clear on it too, okay? And we need to be able to say, as we talked about earlier, you can't just say this is evil because the Bible says so, all right? You can't. Don't use that argument, all right? Say this is evil because this is the fruit of that sin. This is evil because this is the fruit of that sin. We should be able to say why the commands of God are right and true. Okay? All right. Section 3, debating politics with humility and righteousness. The nature of politics necessitates wading into controversy and staying free of offense. I've underlined that because of how important this is, okay? This is difficult, but Satan cannot cast out Satan. Offense is demonic passion, okay? When somebody is offended and they look like they're really passionate about what they're talking about, that is not godly passion. That is demonic passion, okay? We are not to be passionate like people who are offended. Conviction is righteous passion. Okay? I've been convicted by this truth. I know it to be true, and therefore I'm going to speak out on it because of a deep conviction I have, and it's free of personal offense. Okay? I'm not personally offended with these people, but I know what they're doing is evil and wrong. Does this make sense? Learn to discern the difference. Forgive those who sin against you, and practice repentance towards those you speak against in the wrong spirit. Okay, the reason why I say that is because if you start engaging in political conversation, I can almost guarantee you that you are going to run into a time where you get offended and you speak out of that offense one time. Okay? When that happens, it's important that you go back and you correct it. Okay? When you realize, man, I should not have said that, it's important for you to go back and just go to him and say, I'm sorry that I said that. I was wrong, to say that in that spirit. Okay? That's really important. Why? Because that fashions your character. And this is what you need. To be able to engage in politics in the right way, you have to be able to speak free of offense. And to do that, you have to forge the character that you need. It's not easy, okay? People say mean things to me all the time, okay? I brush it off, and I say, I love you, but that's not right, okay? This past week, I got in a little mini Facebook debate with Daniel Kern, who is the head of Crew, the regional head of Crew. Okay, now he's a big leader in Campus Crusade for Christ, and I love that guy. I lived really close to him when I was living up in NorCal. I'd see him at the grocery store and stuff like that. So I love him personally, but I strongly disagree with the direction of where he's moving and where Crew is moving. And I've told him that, and I told him that online. And, he basically said something to the effect of, you need to be more humble. He implied that I was racist and all this kind of stuff. And I said, look, I love you and I respect you, but I disagree with you on this. Okay, I just brushed off the attack, and I come back, and especially when I'm dealing with brothers or sisters in the Lord, I'm always going to try and show honor in a public type of discussion. Okay, when I'm dealing with a brother or sister in the Lord, I'm always going to try and show honor in a public discussion. Now, if I'm not dealing with a brother or sister in the Lord, I don't take such pains to show that type of honor. Okay, and again, I think that's because in the scriptures, that's what we see. Jesus was very harsh towards some people. Okay, specifically, he was harsh towards the self-righteous. Okay, a lot of people, what they want to do is label the people they were harsh with as the religious people. So you'll find a lot of progressive Christians, this is what they do. Who was Jesus harsh with? The religious people like you. But that's not true, okay? Jesus was not super harsh with his own disciples who were very religious people. Okay? No, he was harsh with the self-righteous. Notice Nicodemus, right, was a Pharisee, and Jesus was rather gentle with him. In fact, many Pharisees ended up becoming followers of the way. It talks about this in the book of Acts, okay? So being a Pharisee itself was not necessarily, the criteria for which Jesus was harsh with you. He was harsh with those who were self-righteous. And that's an important distinction to have, because we have many in our culture today who are very self-righteous. They refuse to repent. And when we say, hey, you need to repent of this is wrong, this is evil, they'll come back and they'll accuse you of being evil. That's what they did to Jesus, right? They accused him of blasphemy. They accused him of being wrong. And so what he did, he was very harsh with people who were self-righteous. But those who were sinners and who came in humility, he was very gentle and kind with. Does that make sense? That's the same spirit in which we should engage in all our discussion, but especially when it comes to politics, okay? Forgive those who slander you and who judge you and all that kind of stuff. That's going to happen, okay? That's pretty much going to happen for every Christian in these days, all right? If you're going to be publicly Christian, you are going to start getting slandered. People are going to start speaking bad about you, and they're going to accuse you of being, racist, bigot, sexist, homophobe, et cetera, okay? That's just the way it is now, all right? So if you're going to hold to conservative biblical positions, you are going to be accused of that. So I encourage you, get good at brushing it off. Okay? Just get good at it. Forgive you. I disagree with you, but I love you. Don't take personal offense. And if you can sense that you've been offended by something, then step away from the conversation. Okay? Don't try and continue to engage in the conversation if you know that you're personally offended, because you're just going to have to apologize after. Does that make sense? Right? Get out, deal with it, and then come back in when your heart's good. Okay? It's not easy. All right. This is an important point. Learn to discern the control or the Jezebel spirit. Okay? When someone speaks out of offense, almost always they are operating under a control spirit. This spirit has assumed great authority in our national culture because without a recognized absolute standard of morality, right and wrong become determined by whoever is loudest. Okay, those that appear hurt or wounded are able to appeal to their pain as evidence of wrongdoing, thus exerting great influence in the debate of what is good and evil. Okay? This is the same thing that kids do, all right? This is what children do. Children also operate in the same spirit when they are offended or hurt and use that pain to justify evil behavior. Okay, this is when kids throw temper tantrums, right? When you say, no, you can't have that cookie. Ah! You're mean. I hate you, right? That's exactly what a kid does, right? And that's exactly what a lot of college students do on university campuses today, okay? It's the same spirit. Well, so what do you do with a kid, right? Do you do it back? No, I hate you. Right? Sometimes I do that as a joke to my kids, right? Just for fun. I don't say I hate you, but I say, oh, you're mean, right? And then they get really mad. But no, you just brush it off, okay? You just brush it off, and you hold firm in your no, okay? The control spirit hates no. It does not like no. So you just stand firm, okay? It's very simple to deal with the control spirit. Okay? When somebody freaks out on you, what they're trying to do is control your behavior. They want you to do what they want you to do. Okay? And you just say, no. I love you, but no. And usually that makes the control spirit freak out even more, right? So, for example, if you have a super controlling parent, okay, that parent is controlled by their fear, right? They're afraid that something's going to happen. So, like, you have to study, right? And you're like, well, Mom and Dad, I'm studying, a good amount. But tonight, I'm going to go to a Bible study. And they're like, no, right? No, why? They're so afraid that you're going to fail or get bad grades or something like that, right? So no Bible study, right? You have to study. And if you just say, no, then what happens? Ah! Right? That's a super control spirit, okay? Now, I'm not saying that you should, disobey your parents per se. I'm just trying to give you an example of what a control spirit looks like, okay? Control spirit, when it's told no, it will up the ante. It will get more controlling. Right? Because what is it trying to do? It's trying to intimidate you, scare you, and it can go the other way. It can try and flatter you, it can try and seduce you, right? All to get you to do what you want it to do. That's how it works. So the way you deal with control spirit is to say, no, I love you, but no. You don't have to come back in a crazier control spirit or something like that, right? No, you just brush it off and you ignore them. That's the best thing to do. Just ignore them. Drives them crazy. Drives them crazy. Does that make sense? Matthew 7. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Okay, this is really speaking about offense. When we get offense in our heart, what happens is we become hypersensitive, okay, to the flaws in others. We become very aware of the flaws in other people. In fact, what happens is the flaw, oftentimes that hurt us, becomes the defining characteristic of who that person is now, right? So, for example, if your boyfriend or your girlfriend cheats on you, okay, they cheated on you, but now you're hurt, right? And so that hurt, if it stays in your heart, if it doesn't get healed or dealt with through forgiveness, then what it does is it grows inside of you and it becomes an unrighteous judgment. Now this is not, the person that you loved and is amazing who cheated on you. This is, this person is a slut, right? This person is a terrible person that nobody should date. Why? What's happened? You have now taken that way that you've been hurt and you have characterized that's who they are to you now. Right? Or for example, say you have a group of friends and one of you does something kind of mean and now you're not friends with them anymore. Now who are they? Right? Now they're the enemy, right? They're they're gossipers and slanderers and all this kind of stuff. We characterize them because now we take a flaw that we've seen and now it's become all of who they are. Does this make sense? The truth is that all of us are greatly flawed. All of us have flaws and strengths, but the ones that hurt us, when the hurt stays in us, we become hypersensitive. We see that flaw everywhere now. Does this make sense? Okay, this is why forgiveness is so important. Forgiveness, right, it empties out the offense so that we can see people clearly. When you see people clearly without offense, then you can help them, right? Why? Because you're looking at them and you're seeing them correctly. You're seeing their strengths and their weaknesses. When you see a person's strengths and weaknesses, then you can help them fix their weaknesses. Because why? They sense love from you, not an attempt to control them. Does this kind of make sense? Okay. Paragraph B. Seek to understand both sides of each issue. To be truly educated is to seriously consider both sides of an argument. Knowing only one side and refusing to consider the other at all is arrogant and shuts down meaningful dialogue. Okay, today the bias will be conservative, meaning I'm going to give you a conservative bias to all these positions. Okay, though we'll try and cover both perspectives on some major issues. Now, the reason why I'm going to only take the time to give you a pretty conservative bias here is because I assume that you're hearing the liberal argument other places. Okay, the nature of our universities today is that you're pretty much only going to get the liberal progressive side of the argument, and it's actually very difficult to hear the conservative side. So I'm in discussions all the time with progressive people, and I can tell very rarely have they ever even heard the conservative side of the argument. They just haven't heard it. They've never been taught. They've never seen that evidence that I'm showing them. Okay, I got in a conversation this week because I spoke out on systemic racism. We'll cover that in a little bit. I spoke out on systemic racism. One of my black friends who's a minister was kind of offended. And he said something on Facebook, and we talked about it a little bit, and I called him, and we had a 2-hour conversation. And the conversation was great. Okay, I told him, I love you. This is not intended as an attacking against you. I love you, and here's my evidence. And I showed him all the evidence, and he came around. He now agrees with me. Okay? And that's because I was not offended, right? But he had never heard all that evidence before. Right? And that happens all the time. Happens all the time, right? That all these people who are educated in these universities, they've never heard the conservative evidence for hardly anything. And so what happens, they become self-righteous, and they become super bigoted. Okay? So here, understand this. I don't necessarily have a problem with anyone being a Democrat. I understand why lots of people are Democrats. Okay? But I am going to make a pretty strong case that today you cannot vote pro-choice. Okay? You cannot vote pro-choice in the times that we're living in. I think voting pro-choice today is the same thing as voting for slavery, 200 years ago. I think we're at the same relative positions in our history. Okay, so I have a lot of mercy for believers who have a heart for democratic policies. I think a lot of it is just ignorance. But their heart is they want to help the poor. Okay, when that's your heart, I have a lot of compassion for that. Okay, and I'm like, yes, I understand your heart. You want to help the poor. Now I'm going to try and convince them that democratic policies do not actually help the poor. Okay, but what I sense, lately is I'm becoming much more aggressive against the pro-choice position, and I do think that is by the Spirit. We'll talk about that in just a second when we get a little bit more into abortion. All right, and C, refuse to assume the worst about another's intentions. Okay, humans, generally speaking, rarely commit evil acts believing they are evil. We almost always believe we are doing what is right. Okay, even Hitler was motivated by his love for the German people as he was slaughtering millions of other kinds of people. Okay, it's deception. Okay, almost nobody is evil knowing that they're evil. Okay, almost everyone is evil because what they are doing, they think that they're right. Okay, it's deception, which I think is one of the reasons why God is so merciful towards us humans. Okay, because He understands we're ignorant and we're easily brainwashed. All right, let me pause there before we get into specific issues. Any questions about those general rules of engagement? These are wisdom for us to engage political issues. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, it can be a demon, absolutely. But I think the better way of understanding is just operating in a spirit that behaves like a demon. Does that make sense? So can a demon influence you to behave like that? Well, absolutely. And there are ways that we can have demons influencing us to act like that. But I'm just using it in a general sense. When we act in like that manner, it's acting in a way that's not right. Any other questions? Does that make sense on the control stuff? Look, in Asian families, Asians are terrible with control, okay? It's usually really common in Asian families because Asians don't honor boundaries, right? We don't honor boundaries very well. And because of that, what happens, there's a lot of controlling behavior that goes on, which is why Asians are so easy to manipulate, right? Like, if I wanted to manipulate you guys, man, I could get you good. Right? I could just scare you. I could pretend to prophesy and be like, oh, I see all this sin in your life. I could do all sorts of things to really manipulate you well. And the nature of Asian culture is because we train children to be compliant, right? And we use, there's a shame-based, cultures where we use shame to control people, right? So as a parent, I'll withhold my affection. I won't give affection until you do what I want. And then when you do what I want, then I give you my affection. It's very effective for controlling children, right? Children can be very easily controlled that way, and that's what happens in Asian families. Now, the problem with that is the child lives in perpetual fear of their parents' disfavor, right? Which is why a lot of Asians, it's not just Asians, but it's strong in Asian culture, which is why a lot of Asians struggle with feeling like they're always afraid of making God mad, right? Or upset, right? That's because of the shame-based culture from which we come, okay? So I say that to say, if you have a hard time dealing with the control spirit in your life, right, I urge you, read books on this, study this, learn how to say no to people, okay? Learn how to say no to people. That's important. Learn to put up boundaries even with your parents. Now, I want to be careful here because you are commanded as a child to obey your parents, okay? As you become an adult, you should honor your parents, okay? But if your parents command you to sin against the Lord, you lovingly tell them no. If your parents command you to put the kingdom of God second or third in your life, you say, Mom, I love you, but no, I'm commanded by God to put it first. Does that make sense? Okay? And there's lots of examples of this type of thing, but this is why in Asian culture, look, you know how many Korean cults there are? A lot of Korean cults, okay? Koreans, we are the king of cults, okay? And that's because we have, part of it is because we're so easily controlled, okay? We're so easily controlled. We don't question authority. We don't challenge authority when we should, okay? I'm not saying that we should always challenge authority, but sometimes it's appropriate to challenge authority, okay? And in that spirit, I'll tell you, if you feel like I'm teaching something unbiblical, you should lovingly challenge me, okay? Not in a rebellious spirit, but in a spirit like, Pastor Dennis, I don't see how that can be true since the Bible says this, okay? That's a good way to challenge something, and you should do that. Make sense? Okay. All right, let's dive into major political issues. Okay, I've done quite a bit on abortion. So I'm hoping that you guys understand my basic heart for abortion here, okay? I'm just going to summarize this. Okay, abortion, I think, is the defining issue of our times. I think is the defining issue of our times. And that's because, try and put yourself in these shoes. If abortion is murder, if that's how God sees it, as murder, then we are talking about the greatest genocide in the history of the world that's going on right now, right, with us around. I argue that abortion is the greater slavery. In the same way that during the time of slavery, we dehumanized people who are African, right? What's happening today is a dehumanization of humans. By the way, this is always how it works, okay? Hitler dehumanized Jews. He spoke of them as vermin, right, and insects, right? That language, when people start using that type of language to describe another person, right, it's almost always going to be atrocity time, okay? It's terrible, and that's the way that people speak about the unborn, right, about babies before they're born. Like, they're not human. These aren't human. These are just hair follicles, or, these are like, it's just an extension of the mother's body. Okay, that type of language, that is justifying all the mass murder that's going on. So I am not, what's the word I should use here? I'm not understanding towards abortion. I'm totally understanding if a person has never heard this argument and, if they have a compelling case in Scripture, but I don't think there is one. I don't think there is a compelling biblical argument for pro-choice, okay? In fact, I don't actually know any pro-choice Christians. I only know Christians that are, like, pro-life kind of, right? They're like, oh, yeah, I'm against abortion, but I totally understand why people get abortions. And should we really take away their right to get an abortion? Because how can we impose our morality on them and stuff like that? Those types of arguments, right? I have no patience for that position, okay? No, I'm like, okay, well, can I enslave you and your family? Should people really impose their morality on me if I want to enslave you, right? If I want to kill you? Yes, we should impose our morality, okay? Yes, I have no tolerance for that kind of position. That to me is cowardice, is biblical cowardice. When the Bible is fairly clear on this and we're unwilling to challenge people in their immorality, that's like, you're like the German neighbor, right? Like, oh, this, is a Jew, but, should we really stop, try and stop this? What can we do, right? What can we do? You can speak up. That's what you can do. You could put your foot down. That's what you can do. You can rebuke the people, or you can stand with them and say, you'll take this person over my dead body. That's what you could do, right? So that's the spirit that I think God is filling the church up with in this next generation, because I'm prophesying here, but I think we're at the beginning of a 21st century abolitionist movement, and what happens is the church must get far more militant on this issue, okay? Now, I've talked about this a lot, so I won't belabor this point over and over again. Are there any questions about abortion? Yeah, that's a great question, okay? So the ancient Jewish rabbis, okay, they held that abortion could be considered, that was the exception, okay? If the mother's life was in danger, okay, then that was the one situation where abortion could lawfully be considered. All right? And I think that that's generally right. Now, that being said, I think that almost never happens. Okay? These days, I don't think that there's almost ever a real medical concern for the mom. And in fact, many doctors have talked about this openly, that really, if you're talking about mother's health, it's usually better to do a C-section on the baby, get the baby out to deal with the mother, right? So I don't think that that is a compelling argument most of the case. Now, I don't know, this particular mom situation. What I do know, though, is that many doctors will basically encourage people to get abortions. Okay, when I was, when my wife was pregnant with Judah, okay, we had a prenatal test that came back that showed that Judah had, roughly a 10% chance of having Down syndrome. Okay, and they told us we should get another test to know for sure whether he has Down syndrome, and they were just telling me, yeah, we should get this test. Let's go ahead and schedule this. And at the time, I didn't have insurance, so I was like, wait. All right. How much is this all going to cost, right? And she's like, oh, I don't know, right? So they went back into their books and they looked it up and they're like, oh, it's going to be $3,000, right? I was like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, wait, will this test, can we do anything? Like, if we find out that he does have Down syndrome, can we do some medication? She's like, no, there's nothing you could do. And I'm like, why would I want to get the test? And she was like, well, so you can abort the child, right? And I was like, it's like, no, we're not aborting the child, right? I made that clear. But I could tell the default mentality was like, of course you'd want to consider aborting this child, right? That was the tone of our conversation, right? And that's not unusual, right? It's not unusual. It depends on the doctor, obviously, but a lot of doctors will basically encourage abortions. And that's a problem to me, okay? I don't know the situation in that space, but yeah, I could say in that super rare case where maybe there was a real danger to the mother's life, then yeah, I think abortion is something to consider, right? That we don't have to be like, under no circumstances, no matter what, right? No. If it's the same question, if you have if your kid is about to be hit by a car, should you jump in front of the kid and push the kid out of the way, right? Well, I think, yeah, you should try and do that. But I totally understand if you don't have that courage. Does that make sense? Like, I get it. I can show mercy for that, right? Because somebody's going to die here, right? So I don't think we need to be, super self-righteous in the sense that, no, you got to die for your kid. Die for your kid or you're a horrible person. I don't think you have to do that. But yeah, my heart is like, I think the heart of a parent is, yeah, you should want to give, even if there's a chance that your child will live, right? You want to try and take that chance, right? But I understand I don't think it's sin in that case. Good question. Any other questions regarding abortion? Okay. I'm just assuming that we're all familiar with this issue. Okay, I wrote it down there. I mean, the pro-choice argument is that it's not a child, right? If it's not a child, then it's just like cutting your hair. Yeah, no problem. We're freaking out over nothing. Okay. All right. I'm actually going to skip gay marriage, okay? I wrote this when gay marriage was very relevant. I'll just say this. I do not think today that it is wise for the church to fight for the government to define marriage traditionally. I don't think that's wise, okay? I think what we should do is get the government out of the business of defining marriage at all. The government does not need to define marriage. The government can have a legal relationship, like a civil union or something like that, and that can be fine, okay? So it doesn't have to be the ones to define marriage. I think that's the best way to go about this, because the danger here, and this was the Christian position all along, okay? The danger was this, that if we redefine marriage to be something other than a man and a woman, then what will happen if the government recognizes that decision, then it will start to enforce that definition of marriage on the entire society. And that could open up the church to all sorts of lawsuits and persecution. Right? And by the way, that is exactly what has happened, right? That is exactly what has happened. All of this talk in this, if you're unfamiliar with this debate, okay, the argument went something like this, that if you're gay or you're homosexual, like you are being oppressed by the government because they don't call it a marriage, right? Now, the problem with that argument is that if you were like me and most other pastors, we had no problem with you having a legal status of having a civil union, okay? Go ahead, have a civil union. Civil union gives you all the rights, the legal rights of marriage under the law. I don't have a problem with that, okay? If two gay people want to have a civil union where, like, they visit each other in the hospital, I have no problem with that. That's fine. Go ahead, right? So the whole idea that they were being oppressed because they weren't given the title of married. Does this make sense? This is a giant lie. It was always a lie from the beginning. And the concerns of people like me who were fighting for traditional marriage are totally justified, because what we've seen now is that Christians have started to become persecuted all over the nation for taking a traditional understanding of marriage. Okay? This is a real thing. So I think the wise thing to do for us to fight for is to get the government out of the marriage business. It doesn't need to define marriage for us, okay? Why? Because then the government won't have the power to basically enforce whatever definition of marriage they have, okay? And this is, this is a live issue. Okay, this is a live issue for us as churches. In this next generation, we're going to have to fight for a traditional being able to keep our own definitions of marriage. I don't know if you guys know this, but the California state system basically made InterVarsity illegal for a bunch of years. I don't know how many years it was. There's InterVarsity at Cal State Fullerton now, right? They were basically barred from the campuses for several years, all like 20 California state universities, right? Because they would not allow someone who's openly gay to be on staff. The idea was you had to abide by Christian morality to become a leader at the fellowship. And the university said, no, you're discriminating against the gay community, therefore you're not allowed to be a student group. Okay. Now, what happened was, they sued, okay? They sued through another Christian organization, and they won that lawsuit. But this is happening all over the place, okay? The fire chief in Atlanta got fired. Many of you guys have been following the story of that baker in Colorado, okay? These stories are starting to pop up everywhere now, where people are being taken to court. I don't know if you guys just saw this past week, there was a person in England, right, who misgendered a person on Twitter. Did you guys see this story? This person misgendered a person on Twitter. This person is a trans woman. I always get it mixed up. Okay, if it was a guy who believes she was a girl or vice versa, I don't remember. But she was misgendered by a person. That person reported that person to the police. The police came to that person's home, right, and took them to jail. And they spent the day in jail, right, because this random person on Twitter complained under hate crime laws in England. And this is the problem. Hate crime laws are being pushed for heavily in America. They already have them in Britain. They have them in Canada, right, where you can be thrown into jail for things like hate crimes. This is such a violation of free speech, right? Thank God we have a First Amendment, but it's under attack. And that's why we have these things like freedom marches, right, for free speech marches, where we're fighting for free speech. And now the media is turning against us, literally trying to brand us as like, alt-right. I always get called alt-right, whatever. It's so ridiculous, right? It's such an utter lie, right? I'm freaking half Korean, right? Anyways, whatever. Okay. This is debate today. Now, if you have questions on the sinfulness of homosexuality, okay, this is kind of a separate issue from gay marriage. I would encourage you to read Can You Be Gay and Christian by Michael Brown, okay? It is a very comprehensive book in our library that will cover every single argument for whether the Bible endorses homosexuality. Okay, and it would take all of our time to go in depth into all of those arguments right now. What I will say is this, that there is no compelling biblical argument for this. There's no compelling biblical argument that homosexuality is not a sin. I did a seminar on broken sexuality at the retreat. I'm more than happy to talk to you about why I think the Bible calls it sinful, but I think, as Christians, we have to be pretty clear that this is the test of the day, of the hour. Okay, if we will compromise on this issue, because it's really a question of do we submit under Scripture or not. Does that make sense? Okay, but it's kind of separate from politics, so I'm going to try and just glide over it right now. All right, let's talk about racism, because this is a big one. All right, racism is increasingly viewed through a socialist lens in academic circles in America. In this view, only the racism of powerful classes. Now, we're really speaking about white conservative males. Okay, that's Matt right here. Fernando, you're kind of a white person, bro. That's how it works. You kind of get lumped into white people these days. Yeah. I'm kind of a white person because I'm half white and half Asian. If I was half white, half black, I'd be black, right? If I was half white, half Mexican, I'd be white. That's how it works. What can you do? Okay. Because theirs is the only one that oppresses and disempowers other people groups. Okay, now pause. I want to go in depth into the systemic racism narrative because this is huge. Actually, the thing I get the most hate for speaking out on is systemic racism these days, right? And I have become convinced that this is the dark heart of the whole thing. Okay, this is the dark heart of the whole thing. Now, to understand socialism, you need to understand Karl Marx. Did we cover Karl Marx on day one? We did. Okay, good. Okay, in its simplest understanding, it is oppressed versus oppressor. Okay, it is simply telling you that if you are poor, impoverished, persecuted in any kind of way, hurt is really what it's getting at. If you're hurt, it's because those people have wronged you. Okay, that is Marxism in a nutshell. And it is so compelling. It is so powerful. Why? Because all of our hurt is looking for someone to blame. It's looking for someone or something to blame. And so what we want to do is we want to blame somebody, but Marxism gives us justification for it, right? You're right to blame these people. Now, I want to say this is opposite of what the Bible says, right? The principle the Bible gives you is that you reap what you sow. But guess what? You don't want to hear that if you're wounded, right? You don't want to hear, right? It's my sin that causes all the bad stuff in my life to happen, generally speaking. You don't want to hear that. You want to hear, no, it's their sin that causes bad stuff to happen in my life. And there's an aspect of truth to that. But we need real clarity on how this works. Biblically speaking, if you do what's right, you will be blessed. Right? God tells Cain, if you do what's right, won't it go well with you? Okay. The scriptures talk about this reaping and sowing thing all the time. It talks about how wealth follows righteousness, right? That if a people group does what is right, that they'll be blessed by the Lord. And if they sin, that they'll be cursed by the Lord. It talks about how wealth gotten in a sinful way will only last for a short time, right? And then it'll be lost again. There's many proverbs that talk about this dynamic. All of this wisdom runs counter to the socialist narrative. The socialist narrative is essentially, it's become reformulated in something like this. It's all about white supremacy. Okay? White supremacy is the big socialist evil person these days. Okay? And it's the story about how Europe has always been a culture of white supremacy. And that it went around the world conquering all the other places and enslaving them and taking their resources. And in this way, Europe and America have been oppressing the rest of the world for hundreds of years. And today, their white supremacy is still oppressing minority groups. And every group that is poor, every group that has crime problems or is jailed more, right? All of that is because of white supremacy. Does this make sense? Okay, I can't tell if like you've heard this before, right? I was like, what are you talking about, Pastor Dennis? Right? Okay. All of this is a gigantic lie. Okay? All of this is a gigantic lie because it doesn't follow biblical wisdom. Okay? Here's the truth. We reap what we sow. But how many guys know, if you were to stand up in your ethnic studies class and say, hey, I think the reason why, black people are in jail so much is because, they sin a lot. That'd be like saying homosexuality is sin, right? They would crucify you in that classroom, right? They would kill you in that classroom. And I want to suggest to you that that's a huge problem. Why? Because that's the truth. Okay. If you want to look at black culture in particular, here's what I'm going to tell you. Okay. In black culture today, right? We have higher rates of poverty. We have higher rates of people in jail, right? 40% of black kids grow up without a father. A lot of that is because many fathers are in prison, okay? 13% of the population, that's the black community, okay? They commit more than 50% of the violent crime in America. And those statistics go down the road, right? In fact, black jail rates, I don't know what the term for that is, right? The rate at which black people are in jail is directly proportional to the rate that they're arrested. Right? Because there's this entire narrative that, it's biased convictions, right? There's all these, systemically racist juries and judges out there who are sending black people, they're jailing them at a much higher rate than they're actually committing crimes, okay? And I want to argue there's no statistical evidence or data for this, okay? There's no statistical evidence or data when you dig into the data. What you have is a lot of disparity. So what you see is so for example, how many of you guys are familiar with James Damore? The engineer who got fired from Google. You guys follow that story at all? Okay. There is a big question at Google. Why do we have so many men working at Google? Right? Where are all the women? And of course, the argument that went forward was because we are somehow being biased against women, right, in the workplace. We're somehow, weeding out these female candidates that would be great candidates. And James Damore essentially sent in a memo and said, actually, no, what the studies say is totally different. It essentially says that women don't want to be engineers like men do. Okay? That's what the statistical data says. And for that, he was called a sexist and he was fired. Okay? Now, I hope he sues the heck out of Google, and I hope they award punitive damages. I hope he gets $1 billion from this. Okay? That would be just. The chances of that are low, unless it goes up to the Supreme Court. Lord. Anyways. Okay. Why am I pointing that? Because the left will constantly argue that disparity, if we see unequal outcome, it must be caused by some type of oppression. Every example of unequal outcome is because there's oppression lurking somewhere. We just have to find the oppression. Does that make sense? That's a socialist viewpoint of the world. That's a socialist paradigm. No, I want to argue that when you see unequal outcome, it's because you see unequal sowing. You see unequal righteousness. And that's very offensive to people these days. They don't want to hear, right, that your righteousness is what determines your success. But that's exactly what the scriptures say. So I'll just put it in a simple statistic. In the black community, more than 70% of babies, okay, are conceived to single mothers. Over 70% of pregnancies are to single mothers in the black community. It's the highest out of all minority groups. Okay, Hispanics are about 50%. Whites are about 40%. Guess who the lowest rate is? Asians at 20%. Okay, only 20% of Asian pregnancies are to single mothers. All right, can I suggest that is the most important statistic in this whole story? Okay, in this whole idea. Why? Because Asians, those rates of pregnancy outside of marriage are the exact same rates in terms of success, in terms of median income. Asians have the highest median income in the nation now. Okay, whites are second, Hispanics are third, and blacks are fourth. Okay, it's in the exact same proportion. In fact, what you see, if you just look at whites who are born in broken families, they have the same poverty and criminality rates as blacks who are born in broken families. Right? The issue is not white versus black. The issue is family versus no family. The issue is whole healthy family versus broken family. And this is what the scripture talks about all the time. There's a reason why God is so strict about sex. It's not because he's a prude and he hates it when you have sex, right? No, it's because if you don't have sex within the confines of a committed marriage, you produce unwanted children. And when you produce unwanted children, they grow up with serious issues and it presents all sorts of problems in their lives. Okay? That's why God gives us strict sexual commands. And it's because our nation doesn't want to obey his commands that we refuse to look at the fruit of our disobedience and we blame it on other things now. Does this make sense? So what's the role of the church? The role of the church is to be the light in the darkness. Right? We're supposed to be the ones speaking out and saying, hey, all of this criminality, all of this poverty in our nation, all of this is because of sin. But if you do that today, well, you get to stand with me and have the mean people throw stones at you, right? That's where we are at today. And so that's why I think this is really important. I highly suggest that you study this issue because you won't get those types of statistics in your universities. You will not get that kind of data. But I can point you to just a couple videos. If you just search, what's a good one? Larry Elder, systemic racism. Larry Elder's the man, okay? Look for Coleman Hughes, systemic racism on YouTube. Jason Riley, Thomas Sowell, okay? These are all black intellectuals that are speaking out very publicly about all this stuff. They're going to make the argument that systemic racism is a lie, okay? It is a great, big, fat lie. The data proves it. In fact, what you see is that systemic racism is actually very weak. So, for example, Jews throughout history have been persecuted, have had discriminatory laws placed against them, and they've thrived in every culture group in which they've been in. Why? Well, the same thing, because they have a high value for family, and they have a high value for education. Okay, when you combine high value for family, high value for education within the culture of a people group, you're going to get very prosperous people. Does that make sense? That's the basic idea. Now, let me speak of one other thing, and I'll take some questions on this. The narrative that's been put forward is that black people in America were made slaves, and they've never been able to recover. That's the problem. Historic slavery has caused this brokenness in the black family. A lot of the way it looks is like, no, slave families were separated, right? Fathers were separated from their kids in slavery, and they've never been able to heal since then. I want to say that that is a lie. There is no statistical data to support that theory. Okay. In fact, what you see is that prior to the 1960s, what you see is that there's healthier rates in the family many times in black communities. Right? You actually see blacks are employed at a higher rate than whites. In fact, what you see is in the Jim Crow period, meaning prior to the 1960s, during all the time when they had discriminatory laws placed against them, blacks were closing the income gap with whites, right? They were closing all of these gaps with whites until the 1960s. 1960s, it reverses course, okay? It reverses course. Criminality starts to drastically increase in the black community, okay? Why? Changing moral rules in America, right? People start having sex outside of marriage. And number two, the advent of the welfare state. What happens? The government, in trying to help people, starts to incentivize families to break apart. Why? Because if you're not married, if you're a single mother with a child, well, then the government will give you a check every month. But if that black guy marries you, now you don't get that check anymore. Does this make sense? Our government incentivized couples not to marry. And what that did was you see families all throughout, in every community, but especially in the black community, really start to break apart in the 1960s and 1970s, okay? There's a lot of data on all of this. You know, I'm summarizing a lot of it, but I encourage you, check out YouTube, listen to the interviews yourself. You can read books. Thomas Sowell is the man on this, okay? He is an academic at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. He is an incredible economist who has studied this issue in depth, and he has great data on all this. Now, all this you can't talk about in university, right? They just won't let you. They'll just hammer you constantly for trying to bring up anything like this because it's so far outside the socialist paradigm. Of course. Yeah, if we're talking about systemic racism, it's absolutely wrong, okay? But that being said, it's not very powerful, okay? Now, I would say this. When it comes to police brutality, I don't think there's much evidence that police are more brutal against the black community than against other races, okay? And again, there's a lot of data on this. I would encourage you, if you YouTube Larry Elder's Systemic Racism, he will go over all that data, okay? But ultimately, yeah, it's not very powerful, meaning this. I think the clearest example of systemic racism in our culture is in college admissions. Okay, and it's threatening you guys, all right? All of you guys have felt, right, the effect of systemic racism in your life because all of you should be going to a university that's about a tier above where you're at right now, right? All right, if it was a level playing ground, that's how it would be, right? But the nature of this is that Asians in particular, and white people to a secondary degree, all right, and Jews, are discriminated against in our college admissions. Okay, that is an absolute fact. There's no way, you know, to get around the evidence on that. Now, that being said, has that somehow hurt, you know, Asians in the big picture? A little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. Why? Because our cultural values are so powerful on this, right? It's our cultural values. That's the issue. Cultural values are far more important than things like, you know, discriminatory laws. Those have relatively little effect. And again, we see that not just with Jews throughout history. You see it in a number of different people groups outside the United States as well, right? You see it with Asians and Jews within the United States, but you see it with ethnic Chinese, right, in different parts of East Asia, right? Ethnic Chinese are a minority group. I think in Malaysia, I think there's lots of ethnic Chinese, and they do very well. Their median income is very high, even though there's a lot of discrimination against them in those other nations as well, okay? So again, discriminatory laws have relatively little power. It's cultural values that matter. And I think that that's very biblical. Right? I think there's just so much, like that's like what half the Bible is about, right? Is this aspect of righteousness being blessed. So I find it really problematic when Christians won't even consider this evidence, that they're so convinced by the Marxist narrative that they won't even study this evidence. They won't even look at it. That to me is really disturbing because this is literally what the Bible talks about all the time. And what are we going to say? Oh, no, but in these cases, the Bible doesn't work, or the Bible's wrong in these cases. No, what that means is that you've been so brainwashed by this, you know, by the universities that you won't even hold the scriptures in high esteem in these areas. Okay? No, I think the scriptures are right. And our job is to say, look, this is the job of the church. We should be going, hey, everybody, hey, America, your sexual sin is causing all of these problems. Your sexual sin is causing the poverty, causing the criminality, causing the abortion. It's your sexual sin. And we should be able to make that case with lots of evidence and data, which is there. Okay? We don't have to just go, the Bible says so. But if we don't make that case, how are we going to shift the nation? That's why I say I think systemic racism is at the heart of this. Because what's happened is this national, guilt over slavery has produced like a nucleus that has now been glommed onto by all these other minority groups, right? Like black oppression is at the center, and now it's like, oh yeah, and then women are oppressed, right? And by the way, there's no evidence that women are oppressed in our society today. Sorry, right? We can go into the data on that too. And oh, by the way, gays are oppressed. Same thing. There's no evidence for this. Okay, there's no evidence that gays are oppressed. And now, transgender people are oppressed. How are they oppressed? Well, they can't use the bathroom that they want to use. This is not real oppression. Okay, this is fake outrage. And yet it has consumed our society. Yes. So here we have a disparate outcome again, right? Again, the progressive mindset, the socialist mindset is whenever we see disparate outcome, there must be oppression somewhere. So now we're going to jump and say it's because they're being oppressed. I have no idea on that statistic. We'd have to look into it. But there's a lot of different potential explanations for it, okay? Look, let me tell you, in the transgender community, there's a 40% attempted suicide rate in the transgender community. Okay, 40% attempted suicide. Now, the socialist narrative of why that is because these transgender people are rejected all the time, right? It's because they're oppressed because people attack them and stuff like that. I want to say this. It's possible, I don't know, but no people group in the history of the earth has had an attempted suicide rate of 40%, okay? Except one, and that's Jews living in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. They had an attempted 40% suicide rate, okay? So you can't tell me that transgender people living today, okay, are oppressed like Jews who live in concentration camps in Nazi Germany. There have been lots of oppressed people groups throughout time, and none of them have had anywhere close to that level of attempted suicide. What am I pointing out? I'm pointing out that there's deeper issues involved here, right? It can't just be explained by outward oppression. There's other things going on, and we have to dig into the data. And almost always when you dig into the data, the evidence turns out to be a different story. So never assume, when you hear these examples of disparate outcome rates, never assume that the reason is because of oppression. I encourage you, do research, find out why. Why do we have these disparate outcomes? Okay, in a lot of places, like we mentioned women, right? We mentioned the James Damore case at Google, but the reality is there's a number of different issues like that. In Sweden right now, they have incredible egalitarianism. Okay, women can do whatever they want, and men can do whatever they want, and they're very encouraged to do so in their society. They're where our progressive people want to get to in like 20 years. Okay, that's where Sweden is today. And what you find is that women dominate healthcare. Okay, there's like 80%. Right, of those in healthcare are women, and 80% of those who are engineers are male. Okay, this is in Sweden. Okay, so the idea here is that there are no oppressive factors that are going into making people choose or discourage people from doing this. No, it's gender differences, it's sex differences. Right, there's a sense in which women want to do work in fields where there's more human interaction, where they feel like they're helping people, and they're not sitting behind a computer screen, hitting buttons all day long. Like, that's just how it works. Men tend to like that kind of work more than women, okay? That is a biological difference, but those types of biological differences are now being attacked in our culture as though biology is not a thing that exists, that it's all a social construct that we all put on. That is an absolute lie, okay? There's real biological differences between men and women, and those explain a lot of that disparate outcome. Yes. Absolutely, when we're talking about like victims of rape and sexual assault and stuff like that, for sure. Okay, the aggressors when it comes to sex are almost always men. Okay, now that's not to say that women never do it. Okay, but it's almost always men. It's a biological difference there. Okay, now the question is, how does that translate into systemic racism or systemic discrimination? Right? When we're talking about women's rights, a lot of times what we're talking about is women being discriminated against in terms of hiring and in terms of promotions in the marketplace. Okay, there's no data to support that position, that the gender wage gap. Okay, that does not exist when the data is dug into. What you have is you have a lot of mothers who do not want to be like their hyper competitive male counterparts and work like 100 hours a week, right, and never have a family. Okay, generally speaking, women want families more than men, so they're willing to take time off from the workplace, and they're willing to settle for jobs that pay less because they don't have the same type of competitive drive like a very small percentage of men do. Okay, and it's the same thing. If you look in jail populations, they're dominated by men. Okay, is that because we're discriminating against men? Right? We're evilly incarcerating all the men in the world, right? No, of course not. It's because men are 10% more aggressive than women. Okay, it doesn't mean that all men are more aggressive than women, but it means that you have a lot of overlap, and on the extremes, the most aggressive people on the earth are almost entirely male. Does that make sense? That explains a lot of this type of disparity. So again, just question whenever there's an example of disparity of outcome, we should always dig into the data to find out why. Very rarely is it a case of institutional or systemic racism or discrimination. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about progressive code words, okay? Social justice. Okay, so social justice is an example of a progressive code word, okay? All right, newsflash. No one is against justice, okay? Like, you're not for social justice. Why? You hate justice, right? Or, you know, women's rights. You're against women, right? Nobody is against women or justice, okay? We're against the code words, okay? Women's rights does not mean women's rights. It means abortion, okay? Women's rights is 90% abortion, okay? And it's 10% dealing with, you know, gender pay gap and stuff like that. But generally speaking, these are code words. Social justice is a code word, okay? It's intended to bring confusion so that the idea, again, this is how politics works. You're always trying to brand the other person as an evil person, okay? So when we're talking about pro-choice, the idea is you're anti-choice. You're against women having choice. No, I'm pro-baby, right? It's pro-life versus pro-women or something like that. We're both trying to frame it as though we're the ones who are pro the obvious good thing and you're the one who's anti the obvious bad thing. Does that make sense? Okay, so understand these are the code words that are used. Now, social justice, here's the problem with that term. Many people, especially Christians, when they use the term social justice, what they're really talking about is just charity. Okay, they're talking about helping the poor. Okay, that's fine. Okay, when somebody's like, let's do social justice, and by that they mean let's go and help the poor, let's, you know, go serve and do stuff like that. I'm like, yes, let's do it. I'm all for that stuff. I just don't call it social justice. I call it charity because that's the biblical word. Okay, social justice does not mean charity. It means something different. It means group justice. Okay, it means group justice. The idea is that we're not going to judge people as individuals. We're going to judge them as members of their collective social group. And this social group that's not doing well, we need to fight for them to do well. And again, if the paradigm is because they're being oppressed. Whenever there's disparate outcomes in people groups, the idea is that these people at the bottom are being oppressed. So we're fighting for social justice, which means we're uplifting, you know, the oppressed people group. But what it really means is we're going to start oppressing the oppressive people group. And this is why I speak out a lot against reverse racism, okay? I have no tolerance for people who are straight up racist against white people, okay? That is not because I identify as a white person per se, okay? It's not because I'm like, oh, you're racist against me. No, I don't even see it like that, right? I'm biracial. I don't feel like I fit into any group, okay? I just think you're racist, okay? You're racist when you talk about white people like this as though it's impossible for you to be racist because they're the quote-unquote, you know, oppressor, okay? Does this make sense? I can't stand that kind of stuff. That, to me, is true racism, and I think that there are white supremacists in our day. I think they're very marginalized, and for now, they're very relatively quiet. The ones who are super loud are the reverse racists. The reverse racists are the ones who have huge positions of influence in our culture right now, and I speak out against them very strongly because I think what Satan cannot cast out Satan. If you have the reverse racists spewing all their racism, what it's going to do is it's going to provoke the white supremacists, the real white supremacists, and they're going to get more angry and more powerful. And that is my concern long term. If we don't check the racism of the left, I am concerned that it is going to produce a true alt-right movement that is going to see white supremacy come roaring back in America. And that's going to be scary, okay? Because look, these Antifa guys, at the end of the day, they're like kids, okay? They don't know how to fight. Okay, they're like nerds sitting there in their mom. They're just mad at the world, right? They're just raging, all this kind of stuff. But they're pansies, okay? The scary people, okay, They're the ones who are the pro-military type over here, all right, who are serious, okay? When we're talking about white supremacy, as court, this is a very scary long-term danger and threat for America. So we've got to deal with this because this is going to continue to cause this to grow. Does that make sense? A little bit. Questions about any of that kind of stuff? Social justice. That's why I don't use that term. I don't like that term. Yes? Yes, great question. Okay, what about undocumented immigrants and families being separated at the border? Okay, the issue of families being separated at the border, this is a totally politicized issue at this point, okay? I forget, at the time when it was, raging, I did some study on this, and it's something like this. It's a liberal policy because you couldn't detain children. That was the problem. So if you have a family crossing the border, there was a liberal attempt to say you cannot detain these children. And so it was actually under Obama that they created this policy where they had to be separated. But what happened is when Trump did it, the media blew it up. Okay, so this is a totally politicized issue. Now the question is, what do we do about undocumented immigrants and immigration and all that kind of stuff? I'm a huge believer in legal immigration. Okay, I think legal immigration is a good thing. Does a country have a right to protect its borders and to regulate immigration? I think absolutely. Look, at the end of the day, this is a political issue. You have to be able to see to the root and the core of this. This is a political issue. What's at stake? The future of America. And what I mean by this is this. The vast majority of the undocumented immigrants in our nation are from Mexico, and they're overwhelmingly Democratic. Their children become American citizens and become voters for the Democratic Party. That's what this is about, okay? The Democratic Party does not want to stop illegal immigration. They see it as an influx of new voters every single year. So they're very happy about illegal immigration. Okay? In the same way, conservatives are very concerned that we have an influx of progressive voters and we don't want them flipping us politically, and they're concerned because they weigh on national resources, meaning that we have a policy in America where we care for, especially medically, everyone, regardless of whether you're undocumented or not, whether you have insurance or not. So what happens is all these people who are illegal, they just go to emergency rooms, and that's all covered by the taxpayer. Okay, that's a huge financial burden on the U.S., and there are lots of people who come to take advantage of these public services that are going on in America. Okay, now Ben Shapiro will say straight up, if we don't have a welfare state, then I have no problem with illegal immigration per se. But because we have a welfare state, because we offer public benefits for everyone, regardless of if you're legal or illegal, right? What it does is it creates a huge national drain on our economic resources. So my personal stance is, yes, I do think we should build a wall. I think that's a wise thing. I for sure do not think that it is unloving to build a wall. I don't know how you get there, right? Because then you have to basically make the argument, is it unloving, for you to have, lock the doors to your house, right? Like lots of these celebrities, they have walls around their houses, and they're saying that it's wrong for the United States to have a wall. Well, there's clearly a dissonance in the way that we're thinking here. Right? Because the idea is this: who exactly is caring for these people? How are we treating those who come in? Should we have a right to control our borders? I think very clearly, historically, the answer to that question has always been a resounding yes. Throughout history, for every nation pretty much on the face of the earth, every nation believes it has the right to protect its borders and to regulate the flow of immigrants. The only reason that's become a politicized issue these days is really because the Democrats are pushing an insane policy of open borders. This is absolute insanity, right? To say that no country, especially us, we should not have the right to regulate our borders. Anybody who wants to should be able to come in. There's never been a country on the face of the earth that I'm aware of that has had that kind of a policy. Right? Every government believes it has the right to regulate its borders. But okay, here's the thing. Okay, if we want to go Mosaic law, all right, if they're saying we should embrace the Mosaic law, okay, yes, you care for the immigrants and the aliens. I would argue that that's exactly what we do through legal immigration. It's exactly what we do through legal immigration. Why? Because in the same way, if somebody committed certain sins, you kick them out of the nation, right? It's the same idea. The idea is that we have a nation of certain laws. Okay, and if you obey those laws, then you're part of the community. We love you. But if you disobey those laws, in ancient Israel, they cast people out. They would conquer other people groups, right? They're specifically commanded to conquer neighboring people groups sometimes because of their sin. So I don't like this picking and choosing, right, which aspects of the Mosaic law we're going to follow. No, let's follow the spirit of it, which is we're going to care for the orphan, for the undocumented immigrant. Look, Americans, I think, are the most caring people on the face of the earth. Okay? Especially when we're talking about conservative Christian Americans. We are talking literally about the most caring, most generous, most charitable people group on the face of the earth. So personally, I think it is ridiculous when people accuse us, right, of being unloving because we want to regulate our borders. I'm like, give me a break, okay? Every statistical study shows that the more conservative you are, generally speaking, the more charitable you are with your income and your time in serving other people. So don't give me this stuff about we're not caring. No, statistically, you're not caring, okay? You're not caring. If you look, our denomination, I don't know if you guys realize this, our denomination, we raised over $1 million last year, and this is our SoCal district, right? Just the AG churches in SoCal. We raised over $1 million for Syrian refugees last year. Okay, we sent all of these missionaries and my workers to help with the Syrian refugee issues in Greece and in other places around the world. Okay, we're putting our money where our mouth is. We are caring for these people. Don't tell me you're caring because you're voting for some, politicized policy of open borders, right, that you don't even understand the real arguments for on these things, right? I don't like that kind of, it's shallow. It's shallow. No, let's care for them in truth, okay? I'm all about that. You guys know our church. We support Compassion Kids. I personally support a Compassion Family. Yes, let's care for people, but to say that you can only care in this one way, open borders. No, you're not caring for anybody by fighting for open borders, right? What you're doing is you're encouraging all these people to have unregulated. Do you realize what happens when people immigrate to the United States? Something like 1/3 of the women who try to immigrate here illegally get sexually raped or assaulted. It is a dangerous. Oftentimes there's a lot of oppression from these people trying to get it. Why? Because they're trusting these coyotes and people who are they professionally break the law. That's what they do, right? These are not moral people, and we're encouraging this by having this open border. And then what we're doing is we're encouraging this policy where we have all these illegal immigrants in the United States now, right? And they can't come out of the shadows. They can't become citizens. And so they don't pay taxes, but they can't partake. They're constantly living in fear. I've had friends who are illegal immigrants, and they're afraid all the time. Right? They're afraid that they can't do this. They don't know if they're going to be exposed, all this kind of stuff. Look, it's not healthy. Let's have a lot of legal immigration. Let's regulate it well, and let's do it right. I think that's the conservative position. I'm also potentially for some type of amnesty. I think that's okay. We can do some type of amnesty, meaning those illegal immigrants that are already in the nation, we can have a process for them to citizenship. Now, a lot of conservatives are totally against that, and it's a politicized issue again because they tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic. So they'll become overwhelmingly Democratic voters, and I get that. I understand that. I'm open to some form of amnesty, right, where we build the process, but then we have to secure our borders. If we don't secure our borders, then we're going to have a perpetual amnesty problem, right? Let's secure the borders and let's get a good immigration program. But again, the Democrats don't want a clear immigration policy. They want unchecked, undocumented immigration. They want unmitigated immigrants, right? Because they see them as potential voters. Okay? If these were all, conservative Republicans immigrating through the southern border, I promise you, the Democrats would be closing that border ASAP. Good question. Any other questions on this issue? Okay, any other political issues? Capital punishment, gun control, school choice, climate change, Israel, healthcare. Yes. Yeah, good question. Okay, I think, I take the conservative position on this, okay, which is I think that the climate has always been changing in the earth. Okay, climate's always been changing. It always goes up or down throughout history in different ways. Okay. Now the question is, to what degree is human activity, specifically carbon emissions, causing the climate to get hotter? And I think it's possible. I think it's possible that human activity is causing the Earth to get warmer in some ways. Right? Now I do not buy into the whole scare tactic of the world is going to end in 20 years if we don't do something. I'm just very skeptical. I think it's highly unlikely because, by the way, I don't know if you guys realize this, but that's what they were saying 20 years ago. Right? 20 years ago they were saying in 20 years we're all going to be dead. We're going to be underwater. All right, you guys watch An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore? Okay, this is the case they were making 20 years ago. They were saying it's imminent, it's right about to happen. Yes. Okay. Yeah, right. So they were clearly lying then, or they were exaggerating the data, which I think is likely. Okay, and I think they're doing the same thing now. Now, the more important question is, what can we actually do to stop carbon emissions? Now, if there's an easy solution to this, I'm all for it. Fine, let's fix carbon emissions, right? The problem is there's no easy solution. Why? The Western world only contributes now 20% to global carbon emissions. Okay, really, it's China and India. These are developing nations that have no interest in seriously curbing their carbon emissions. So if you're serious, if you really believe the world is going to end, in 50 years unless we get our CO2 emissions down, then I'll tell you what we really have to do. We literally have to conquer China and India. Okay? We have to conquer them. That's the only way. Because we can't stop them. Okay? The Paris climate agreements, these are voluntary agreements that nations make that they break all the time. Okay? So there is no solution for this. There's no solution to cut down carbon emissions. The best thing that's being done is that private companies are creating green solutions, like Tesla and stuff like that, right? That's great. I think the market is always the best way to solve this. When the government tries to do it through government, it almost always makes it far worse than it's possible. Like the Green New Deal, it's going to cost trillions of dollars, and it's going to curb, the temperature. I saw the statistic. It's going to bring it down like 0.7 of a degree in 100 years or something like that, for trillions of dollars worth of spending. And that generally tends to be how these policies are, right? So a lot of this is politicized, and it's hype, and it's to try and scare you into voting the way they want you to vote. That's really what a lot of this is, in my opinion. Yes. 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 I think gun control is super important, right? Meaning I think gun rights are super important. Clarify. Okay. All right. 80% of murders in the United States are caused, right, by pistols, not by rifles. Okay. The vast majority of murders. So first of all, 11,000 deaths a year. That's how many we're talking about. Okay. Gun deaths, gun homicides in America, about 11,000 a year. Okay. Mass murders in the nation. I forgot this. It's something like an average of 50 people a year, maybe less than that. Okay. How many people are killed through abortion every year in America? We're at about 700,000. Okay? 700,000 babies are killed every year through abortion. 11,000 are killed via gun murder, okay? And about 50 people a year, and I think that's actually high. I think it's less than that, are killed through mass shootings and stuff like that. Okay? Now what happens is every time there's a mass shooting, the media explodes. Like, oh my gosh, we've got to stop all the guns, right? We have to stop them. We're talking about 50 deaths a year. It's nothing, right? It's nothing compared to gun deaths, which is pistols, right? And the vast majority of that is pistols, and a lot of this is gang warfare and stuff like that, okay? There's no talk about curbing pistols and stuff like that. So, and because gun control doesn't work. It's never worked. In any country that's tried it, it's never worked because you find other ways to kill people that you really want to kill, okay? England did a gun confiscation. They confiscated the guns of every single person in the state. And you know what happened? The murder rate rose, okay? It rose. And people started to find other ways to kill each other. How? With knives, and now they're using acid and stuff like that, right? There's a lot of terrorism problems in England these days. So you can't tell me that gun control works because there's no statistical evidence that it actually works, okay? What they're going to say is that gun disparity, right? There's deaths. It must be the guns, lots of guns. No evidence that gun control works. And in fact, you have to understand, what is the purpose of the Second Amendment? Who knows what the purpose of it is? Yes, okay? The purpose of gun rights is not so that you can go hunting whenever you want, okay? The purpose is so that we can effectively revolt against our government if it gets out of control. Okay, that is such an important right that has been given us. And I emphasize this all the time because throughout history, the greatest oppressors in the earth are human governments. The Second Amendment is given to us as a final stopgap, as a final defense against government tyranny. What happened in Germany? Gun control before Hitler came on, right? They took away the guns of everyone so that the people could not effectively revolt against his crazy government, okay? This has happened throughout history where governments, when they start becoming oppressive, oftentimes they will limit the arms. They will take away the arms of their people, okay? So I'm very big into having the right to own guns. I think it's a good thing. Now, if we start seeing mass murders like 1,000 a year, 2,000 a year, I think we can start having a more serious conversation about this. But when we're talking about, 50 killed in mass murders every year, come on, give me a break. Give me a break. Let's deal with the 700,000 abortions. It's not even close. Armed guards. Armed guards, and I think we should arm teachers. I think it's a good idea. Now, here's the thing: we don't need to give every teacher a gun, but what we can do is provide certification routes so that teachers who want to can become certified, right, and then have very specific ways of how they can have a handgun in the classroom. It would have to be in a safe. It would have to be, locked in certain ways so that kids can't have access to it and stuff like that. Okay, but yes, I think that's wise. Because what we've done, if we make schools gun-free zones, what that says to criminals is that they can get away with this. Okay, so yeah, I think we should have situations. Because again, if you want to kill people, you don't need a gun to do it. All right, you could find other ways to kill people. And unfortunately, you have to understand. I forget the statistic. There's more guns in America than in any country in the world by a huge margin. Okay. If the gun control people would have the way, this is what would happen. Okay, rifles would become illegal. That wouldn't solve anything. So next, they would come for your handguns. Okay. Now, if they somehow manage to confiscate, if they pass legislation to confiscate your guns, they would never be able to get all the guns. There are millions, hundreds of millions of guns in America. They are all over the place. Okay, the government is not able to get all of these guns. Not possible. So gun control in general is not an effective solution for this problem. Best idea I have is arming teachers. There are no great solutions, though. I am unaware of anything that would seriously, fix the problem, because it's a terrorism problem. Okay. What we don't understand is in America we have relatively almost no terrorism compared to the rest of the world. Okay. If you're in the Middle East, do you understand terrorist attacks happen almost every single day in the Middle East? They happen all the time. If you want to be blunt about it, okay, Islam is the thing that we should be seriously afraid of importing into the United States. Wherever Muslims get a strong minority, you almost certainly start getting increases in terrorism. Okay? And that's because, by our standards, about 10 to 15% of Muslims are radical by Western standards. Okay, that's what Europe is learning right now, right? That all of this Muslim immigration is causing terrorism to spike in really alarming ways. And that's why far-right parties are starting to come to power all throughout Europe, because people are realizing that it was absolute foolishness to invite all of these Muslims into the nation thinking that they would, assimilate to European culture. What's actually happening is more Europeans are getting converted to Islam than Islams are converting away from Islam. Make sense? All of these issues, I'm just giving you my take, okay? Please, research, okay? Look at the evidence for yourself. Okay, any other issues, and we're going to wrap it up. Okay, very good. My closing encouragement is this. We cannot appeal to biblical authority when we're talking to non-believers. Okay? When we're talking amongst believers, we can talk about the Bible, we can debate the Bible. But when we're talking to non-believers, we need to know the data. Okay? So you've got to study. Sorry, you're not going to get that at your university. You have to hear what they're teaching at university and compare it to some of these conservative scholars. Okay? And then you'll have a balanced, educated perspective. And the education is actually what's really important, because then you have a tempered, that keeps you from becoming self-righteous in either context, right? When you understand both sides of the argument, then what happens is you can understand the people on the other side. You understand why the way they think that way. And you can have a solid argument to counter-argue against it. Make sense? Okay.